Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Lori Orlando, who's the director of the Precision Medicine Program at the Center for Applied Genomics and Precision Medicine at Duke University. I'm actually from the Raleigh area. I went to UNC growing up, but we're not going to hold it against Lori today, even though our schools are lifetime sports rivals. They're longtime collaborators in genomics and precision medicine. So maybe we'll talk about growing up in or living in the Raleigh area a little bit. But Lori's background is all around integrating family history, genomic data, and other information to guide clinical care and ultimately deliver a better outcome for patients. So we're going to have a great discussion, I think, today about the role that genetics can play in primary care and about Lori's work more broadly. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Great. And I just will say, as an aside, I grew up in Chapel Hill. My dad worked for UNC, so there's no bias there.
Yes, wonderful. That's great. What drew you to the area? You did your some of your schooling in Tulane, right, which is in New Orleans. But what brought you to the Raleigh-Durham area?
Fellowship. So I did my medical school and residency at Tulane. I loved it there. I actually was very interested in decision modeling. I love math. Very weird for a doctor. And so that was one of the best programs in the country at the time. So I came back to do that. And then I was going to go back to New Orleans, but Hurricane Katrina changed all that.
Oh, wow.
So really loved the fellowship and loved the people I was working with. So I just decided to stay at Duke, and I've been there 23 years now. And that was not how I thought my career was going to go, but it's been great.
No. Did you say you grew up in New Orleans, or did you grow up somewhere?
No, I grew up in Chapel Hill.
Oh, you grew up in Chapel Hill.
Yeah, I grew up in Chapel Hill. So it was actually coming back. I met my husband in high school. So his family was here. My family was here. It was kind of an easy decision to come back.
Yeah, definitely. If any listeners haven't been to Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, it's definitely worth a trip, especially if you're in this business. There's plenty of people you can meet and interesting conversations you can have.
Absolutely. It's a great place to be.
Yeah. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, so to get back to the, like, what I do. Yeah. So I told you, I started off in mathematical modeling, doing decision-making for like Medicare coverage decisions and stuff like that. And it felt very removed from my clinical practice. So I'm an internist. I'm not a genetics provider. And at the time, genetics was kind of a bad word in the internist world because it was just a lot of stuff that didn't seem to have a lot of clinical relevance, right? There was things we knew were really important, like BRCA mutations, right? They had just discovered those genes. We knew they were really important, but everybody thought they were super rare. And if we saw a person with a gene mutation like that, we'd sort of know intuitively that that person was unique and special, but there were very few of them. And what became pretty clear once I started doing the work in family history was that, these are not rare. Right. They're very common, and no, we don't know them when we see them. And so it all started with this family history study in the Greensboro area. We had a collaboration between Duke and UNCG, which is UNC Greensboro, and the Cone Health System in Greensboro, to see if we could bring precision medicine to North Carolina primary care practices, starting with family history as a gateway drug, kind of.
Yes.
And it was funded by the North Carolina legislature. They were way ahead of their time at that point. It was, again, 2007, we were still on paper records, no electronic medical records.
Wow.
So it was very, very foresightful on their part. And again, the study was just remarkable. The patients loved it. They were coming into the clinic. They were entering information into a software system in the clinic. And it was putting out the sort of risk information to them, talk to your doctor about these things that you entered about your family history, and then we'd give the report to the doctor that would say, hey, this patient meets criteria for genetic testing, and this is why, and this is what you might want to do with them. And so everybody was really engaged in this. We had a genetic counselor who was embedded in the clinic, and it showed for the very first time, like 20% of the general population needed some type of change in their care for prevention due to being at higher risk than average for a disease. And we were only looking at 5 diseases at the time. And so that was shocking. We thought, okay, there's something weird about the people who are enrolling in this study, or weird about Greensboro. So let's just take a step back and see if this is real. So we replicated that study in 5 healthcare systems across the US. And these were very unique. So we did it in a military health system. We did it at Duke, so your academic, high quality medical center. And we did it in Essentia Rural Health Institute in Minnesota and University of Medical Wisconsin. We did it in some inner city populations there. We saw the same thing. Every clinic, every health system, didn't matter who the population was, didn't matter what type of health system it was. So then we said, okay, this is real. This
Not
is
just
really
something
important.
in the water in Greensboro.
Yeah, like we're not just making nothing out of, something out of nothing. This was a real finding. So that really propelled me down this pathway as an internist to say, we need to be in primary care finding these people. And what happened at the same time was around the time that second study stopped, was around the time ONC started pushing for electronic medical records and getting health systems to change, and which happened very quickly. And they were also pushing out data standards for sharing of data and being secure, but also being transparent. And that was a huge opportunity, right, for a tool that was sitting on a computer in a clinic, right, totally isolated from everything. We went from that to this web-based software as a service, using Smart on Fire to connect to people's medical records, so to communicate to the patients, pull data out of their medical record, and then also to give the providers an input into their medical record instead of just printing out a paper report and handing it to them. And that sort of changed a lot for me as well. I started to get more and more interested in informatics and how we could leverage informatics to improve our workflows, and to identify people like this in the clinics.
So what were those first 5 diseases that you started with? What were they? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, Lynch syndrome. So the ones that are now part of the CDC's, everybody should be screened for. So familial hypercholesterolemia, Lynch syndrome, hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. And then we did familial risk for breast cancer and colon cancer. So there are these people that they probably don't have a genetic mutation, but they definitely are at higher than average risk. And so for breast cancer, those people usually get breast MRIs instead of just mammograms. And then for the colon cancer, the colonoscopies tend to be start earlier, be more frequent, right? And so those were the ones that we were looking at in that first study. But now we have 148 conditions that we collect on individuals and their family members. We do risk assessment for 45 different conditions. So we're looking at hereditary cancers, hereditary cardiovascular diseases, hereditary liver diseases, and then also, the familial risk for a variety of conditions and cardiovascular disease and others. So we've continued to keep expanding as the opportunities have arisen, and as more and more knowledge has been generated, right? Genetics is the most amazing thing. When I think back to being in medical school and them discovering this one gene, right? And to where we are now, it's just absolutely amazing. And even now, we're still, the rate of new knowledge generated is just enormous. There are, ClinVar is a NIH-funded database where labs will upload information about genetics and phenotypes when we don't know whether that phenotype and that genetic mutation means something. And then if enough people upload that, then we can look at that data and go, oh yes, we now have enough data to say that is pathogenic or it's not pathogenic. So those sorts of resources, as well as the Undiagnosed Disease Network, which is another NIH-funded network where they take patients who've been on these diagnostic odysseys and nobody really knows what's wrong with them and do sequencing. Between those two, they've identified like hundreds of new medical conditions and new variants that are pathogenic. So again, like the speed of new knowledge is just astronomical. But so during all of this, a new field of science emerged called implementation science. So I'm a health services researcher. That's, all about kind of how do you do studies well that show clinical efficacy, clinical effectiveness, and then how do you, what do you need to do to change clinical guidelines? And it was clear that you could have a lot of studies published that showed clear clinical effectiveness, right? We should be doing this, but it would take 15 years for the doctors to change their practice. And that seemed shocking at the time because, you should read the data and do it. But it became clear that there was just so much more to this than just motivating doctors to make changes, right? And so this whole field evolved, and it too has also rapidly scaled up. So we started with a bunch of just theoretical models about these types of concepts might influence these behaviors. And so let's prove if that's true, to actually having full scale measures and a whole well-developed field of science now. And genomics is the perfect place for implementation science because genomics is not a chemistry test. And internists work very hard. They see a lot of patients. They don't have a lot of time. And nobody's teaching this stuff in medical school or residency. So they're coming out of their training with no understanding of genomics, and they don't have the ability to try to learn that once they get out. There's just
too much going on. Yeah,
it's tough being an internist. Most of the ones that I trained with, they don't practice anymore. And recently, they announced that a lot of primary care residencies did not match this year. I mean, the world has changed a lot, and so adding more to, we'll just train them, or we're just gonna ask them to do this doesn't work because it's very different from their normal workflows. A gene, for example, like I see patients in my clinic all the time. I get to spend a lot of time with my patients, which is great. But I understand the kinds of people and the concepts of the physicians that would be doing this in primary care need to understand. And there are things like, I have a patient who came in, has terrible family history of breast and ovarian cancer, but she says, "Oh, you don't have to worry, we're negative." And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And that means, well, my mom had breast cancer at 30. She had a genetic test and it was negative. And so, we don't have that gene in our family. And it turns out that test was a BRCA1 only test. It was a genotype test, which means they only looked for very specific variants and they can't go back and reanalyze it. And it was done 15 years ago. Right now we're doing panels of 50 different genes and looking at hundreds of different invariants in each of those genes. Like that's not you don't need any more evaluation tests. So you have to know that, though. You have to know the difference between a sequence and a genotype, and you have to know like what time frame things were really changing, and you have to know who got tested, and so it's just not as simple as saying, hey, you guys should be paying attention to this.
So within implementation science, where is if you could boil it down to the 2 or 3 biggest challenges, like what gets in the way of what is in this 15-year gap? What are the biggest challenges for genomics if we took that, or genetic testing if we took that as an example?
Yeah, I think, well, the biggest thing that needs to change is the training, right? When they're learning, they need to be learning these concepts so they come out ready to be able to ingest that information. But right now, the things that we need to do are primarily in internal medicine, primary care practices. What we're focusing on is risk, right? We're trying to find these people who have high risk variants that are going to develop a disease soon, but are still healthy. We don't want to wait till they got the breast cancer for the oncologist to go, "Oh yeah, you should get testing." So we need to help them. We need to help them, one, find those people. And we know we can do that. That's a lot of that work that I've done in family history is if you ask the patients to fill this information out ahead of time, give them an opportunity to talk with their family members about what kinds of medical conditions run in their family and the ages at which people develop those conditions, enter that in a software system and give that, back to the patient, back to the provider. We know we can find them. And we know that it'll motivate the patient to kind of keep that conversation going, which is also important because patients are a barrier.
Yeah.
We had a patient in one of our studies just recently. They went all the way through the whole thing. They signed up for a risk assessment study. They completed the family history. They got a recommendation to talk to a genetic counselor, and they go, yeah, I don't want to. And that's a highly motivated patient right there who just like ended at the, no, I'm not going to take that next step. So they also need their little motivations as well. But so we need to help the providers find them. We need to tell the providers what tests they need. So, is it mostly now we're doing panels, right, for risk assessment. And so that's actually become very easy to order. They've become really inexpensive. The company that I use a lot for my patients, it's $200 to get a hereditary cancer panel.
Right.
So, it's becoming more and more affordable. Insurance is covering it more and more. But again, what do you order? And what does the patient need to know? Because there is some counseling that has to happen there. There are not enough genetic counselors out there to do this, but there are other tools. There's videos, there's chat bots. There's a lot of tools that have come out that have been shown repeatedly in studies that if you share this with the patient, they will have enough understanding of the concepts to be able to make an informed decision about whether to move forward or not, right? So all of that can also be done electronically within the workflow of the electronic medical record, because you have the patient portal where you can share this information. And then the provider can answer some follow-up questions if needed, or there can be an e-consult to a genetic counselor if needed, something like that. So that's the second barrier. So the first one was identifying. The second one is kind of knowing what to order, how to order it, and making sure the patient has the appropriate information. And then the last thing is understanding what the test results mean when they come back.
Right.
And again, with risk assessment, it's fairly straightforward. It's not nearly as complicated as some of the other things like diagnoses, but there are changes to their care that need to happen. Like if you have a pathogenic variant for Lynch syndrome, you need to know that that person needs a colonoscopy every other year and or every year, and an EGD every other year, and a screening for kidney cancer and uterine cancer and maybe a hysterectomy. So all that stuff has to happen, and the primary care doctor needs to push all of that forward. And so again, in the electronic medical record, we now have the capabilities where we can, in health maintenance sections, say, okay, this patient has a syndrome, and associated with that syndrome are these health maintenance practices that need to happen. And so again, we can help them with that. And so I think leveraging that whole informatics infrastructure can really help us overcoming a lot of the barriers that exist today. But it's a lot of work to bring all that together, and it's still in its infancy, but I think really great opportunities, moving forward very quickly.
Yeah, interesting. So if we think about how it is today, like one of the things that strikes me as one of the challenges is just the sheer breadth of diseases that we could be working with. Anything from, breast cancer. My mother had it at age 30, and I'm concerned that I may be a carrier through to Alzheimer's. I have a uncle or father or grandfather who's suffering from it, and I'm concerned about that and everything in between. And maybe we could think through like an example of what this would look like today in a typical primary care practice that or would work with. If someone comes in and they use a family history tool like MeTree that you've developed that I think we'll talk about later, hopefully, and they indicate that they have a family history in one of these areas, and you order the right test, how then does the primary care doctor, when the test result comes back, know the right things to do? Like, are there clear pathways for the hundreds of diseases where we've got genetic panels available and ready to order, or is there a little bit of improvisation that's needed on the part of the primary care provider of, okay, we've got an ApoE4 result, so there's an Alzheimer's risk that I need to think about, but like, is there a playbook for how do I work with this person or this family, or do they then have to come up with the playbook on the fly based on the result?
Yeah, it depends on the condition. So at the NCCN, so the National, Comprehensive Cancer Network, they're very good about publishing a very clear playbook about what to do with hereditary cancer variants, right? So it's all laid out right there. I won't say that their documents are the easiest to follow, but the information is there. In Alzheimer's disease, there's no information, right? So the best study that's ever been done on this was done, it basically said, we told them that they had high risk and we monitored what they did. And basically they all went out and got better life insurance, right? It just doesn't make the insurance companies very happy.
No, yeah, that's good. It's good for some, not so good for others.
Right. So cardiovascular disease, so cancer is very, I think, it's been the one with the most, the longest timeline that we've been aware of, has a lot of money invested in sort of developing these, and a lot of interest because cancer is sort of scary, and a lot of attention is paid to that. But other fields are sort of more in their infancy. So I would say neurology is very, very much in the infancy. There's not a lot we know to do about Alzheimer's yet either. But things like cardiovascular disease and liver diseases, they are actually better and better defined. For example, hemochromatosis and liver disease, and hereditary cardiomyopathies, right? So like those conditions that the 18-year-old on the basketball court is, healthy and then suddenly drops dead. Like we're getting better and better at understanding the genetics of those things, have diagnostic tests for them, and know how to screen and treat, right? And so that it's not as clear. They don't have the equivalent of the NCCN in the cardiology field yet, but they are talking a lot about it. And it is pretty clear amongst the people who are experts in that area what should be done. So you can find that information if you read the literature, or you could consult your local cardiologist and they would probably have a pretty clear idea of what you should do. And you could either refer or you could do it yourself. So I think, again, we have a long way to go. This is why implementation science and genomics is so important. Like you said, it's an enormous breadth of things where they're all different and the processes would be different afterwards, but finding that path forward now, because it's clear that we don't want to wait until we know everything to start trying to help the patients. We need to start now and just learn as we go, which is what a lot of my trials are about now, is kind of figuring out, how do you do this, especially in environments like rural environments, low literacy environments, where they don't have a genetic counselor, they don't have a medical geneticist, they don't have anything, and you don't want to make health disparities worse because they don't have access to resources that academic medical centers do. You want to make sure that we're not increasing the divide. Right?
Yeah. What ideas or solutions have you seen there that could help to not increase the divide, but actually bring more people into the system that seems to be working in many academic medical centers, but hasn't scaled out yet?
Yeah. So there's been some interesting in studies. So there's I just actually came back from the Biden Moonshot grant funding. They bring together all of us who have a grant to speak once a year with each other about what we're doing and share ideas. Which is great. It's a lot of fun. And so one of the groups in Oregon is doing a whole social media campaign around Latinos and Spanish-speaking people in the state, and trying to get them through Twitter and Facebook to understand they too have risks, and understanding how you communicate that information to someone from their culture. And so they've done a lot of work to understand that like family is really important to them. So that's a great way to get at it, because if you get genetic testing, it does not affect just you. It affects your whole family, right? They're all at potential risk for having that same variant, and would change their care. So a lot of parents will do it not because they care about what's happening to them, but because of what it means for their children. So understanding that and using that as a tool to say, okay, this is something you should be thinking about. And so that is one really good example. Another is actually that the CDC has gone ahead and said everybody should just be screened for these 3 conditions that have a fairly high prevalence, and we have actionable items that we can do about them. So hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, Lynch syndrome, and familial hypercholesterolemia. there's no barriers to testing other than just somebody having an awareness that it needs, it should be done on everybody. Like, you don't have to collect that family history. You don't have to have X condition, you just do it. And so those have also helped bridge some of the gaps in the lower literacy communities where the providers there just don't have a lot of awareness, but at least they know everybody gets these tests. There's no block to that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's
and then,
interesting.
yeah. And then again, the COVID was horrible. It was particularly horrible for doctors, but it actually did one really nice thing, which was the evolution of this technology, right? Zoom and other platforms for remote communication. And so a lot of work has gone into how do you scale genetic counseling and how do you get information to those patients? And that's where all these videos have been developed, and chat bots, and even sort of just remote genetic counseling using Zoom. And all of those things have also really helped a lot with these people in rural communities where there's nowhere to drive to get that counseling session, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually one of the follow-up questions I was going to ask, was around how you see the role of genetic counseling evolving in primary care, and a couple of, like, I guess context pieces on this from more of the monogenic rare disease world. The gold standard in quotes would be pre-test counseling, really helps someone understand what are you getting into by requesting this test or getting the test, and then obviously post-test counseling to help you understand what the impacts are, what you might do with it, how you talk to your family, to some of the points that you made. I had a very thought-provoking conversation with Wendy Chung recently, who's at Boston Children's and Harvard, and running the Guardian study, which is a newborn screening program. And we spoke about this same issue, because when you're thinking about how you scale up newborn screening across the whole population, the bottleneck of pre-test genetic counseling becomes an enormous factor at some point. And I think it's the same issue here. And she made the point that perhaps over time, as genetics education and understanding becomes more and more part of part of our cultural fabric, then there may be less of a need for pre-test counseling, especially in cases where in most cases you're not going to get a positive result, but in some cases you are. I'm interested in your perspective on that, because if you took the monogenic rare disease gold standard of pre and post-test counseling and applied that across every primary care discussion around genetic testing in America, there's you're going to need a lot of genetic counselors or a very good AI that we trust very well to run those conversations. I don't think we're ready for either of them yet.
No. So yeah. So actually this came up in the MeTree meeting as well. The multiple conversations around it. In fact, a person brought up the example of HIV, right? So when I was in training, HIV was incredibly prevalent. We had very poor drugs, and it was a really big deal. You couldn't test someone without a whole informed consent process, sort of like now, where you have to do this informed consent process to do genetic testing. There was lots of connotations around that condition, same as genetic conditions. And now today you can get a home test kit for HIV, and nobody consents anybody for testing. And, so it could evolve. I think probably it should evolve. And I think right now the bigger problem is just that there are these important implications around insurance and follow-up care, and what it means for family members who may not want to know that we need to work through. But I think that there are a lot of conditions, for example, pharmacogenomics, right? Testing for variants that affect the way you metabolize drugs and should change the dosage of the drug, or maybe the type of drug that you receive in specific situations. We don't do genetic counseling for that, because there's no, cancer connotation around that, but it's a genetic test and it has, implications. So I think that's a really good example of how things may evolve over time to not requiring at least the pre-test genetic counseling. Right now, pathogenic variant, test result, maybe you do need the genetic counselor to work through some of your unique questions, right? And I think that that's where things are going. It seemed like, based on the conversations that we were having yesterday at our network meeting, that is where a lot of people are going, is take away pretest counseling, just give them those key pieces of information, either through a handout or a video or a chat bot. And then if they're negative, you can quickly just say, hey, everything's fine. But if they're positive, then having someone with a better understanding of how to communicate that does it.
Yeah, definitely.
And then it would be a lot shorter, right? Because one of the big issues is genetic counseling takes an hour. So they could see 8 people a day, and there's tons and tons and tons of people who need to be tested. But when you're getting to okay, who's positive, that's a much smaller number of people. And it's probably a shorter conversation because there's less content to go over.
Yeah. I'm interested in your perspective on the class of diseases where the genetics and behavior environment are deeply intertwined. Like I'm thinking, for example, of no longer NAFLD and NASH, now MASLD and MASH, so metabolic associated steatotic hepatitis, liver disease that we know have some strong genetic risk factors, like PNPLA3 is a quite common and famous example, but we also know that the risk of that gene is far higher in people who are obese, for example, or have or have a higher BMI than average. So there's an interaction here, and this implies that knowing you have the genotype could actually lead to a behavior change that essentially eliminates or greatly reduces the genetic risk that you took on. And so this seems like an amazing opportunity at primary care, but we know behavior change is hard. We're laying this on top of communicating complex genetic results. I wonder how you think about the opportunity in that arena, where the genetic result, maybe the next step is simply working with the patient or the family on lifestyle modifications, behavior changes. Who pays for those kind of things? How do we operationalize those? Because it seems like a potentially low cost way to make a massive impact on the healthcare system, but obviously not easy to do by any stretch.
Yeah. So that's a great example. Type 2 diabetes is also a really good example, right? Because it's so prevalent, and it's got like 200, genes are involved in these PRS scores around type 2 diabetes. So do those people get a different sort of counseling around their diet and their exercise to reduce their body fat, to reduce their sugar intake, and I think the answer is, yes, and there should be a strong motivation for insurance companies to do this, because they're going to avoid all of those long-term serious complications that are associated with those diseases. I mean, a liver transplant's not cheap, and NASH, or whatever it's called now, is the leading cause of liver failure these days. And so if we, it's hard with the insurance companies the way the US system is structured, because it doesn't have a baseline. Everybody gets preventative health. And so the insurance companies say, we don't keep our patients for more than 2 or 3 years at a time, and then they move on to somebody else. And so why should we invest in preventive care if we're not going to reap the rewards of that? Now, if the patient stayed with them, for life, then they would be more motivated to do that. Eventually, I think those patients end up coming back around. So I think the argument's not as great as I think it is, but it is a harder sell for us to get any sort of preventative care measures covered by insurance. But my clinic, I work in a executive health clinic where I spend an hour and a half with each of my patients, and they all spend an hour with a nutritionist, an exercise physiologist, and a psychologist. And we have to charge cash for those services because we're not allowed to bill for them. Yet, in 22 years of practice, I have had no patient ever go from prediabetes to diabetes. I have had, no patient develop a heart attack, not one in 20 years. I mean, it works really well. And so when you're able to give them these resources, which we currently can't bill for, then we can make real changes. And when you add, I think, the layer of you have a genetic predisposition, it's not just that you're overweight, or you're bad at controlling your diet. There are things there that you can't control, that don't, because they feel a lot of guilt, and then the guilt blocks them, right? It keeps them from being able to make those mental changes that will allow them to change their lifestyle. And when you remove that, they can make huge, I mean, I've seen enormous, I mean, I've had people lose regularly 20, 30 pounds in between visits because they had this, they were given tools that they needed and could use. And I think that would be a great benefit of being able to add genetic testing. So one, to get the insurance companies to pay more attention to these services you currently can't bill for, and say, well, not only if they have type 2 diabetes should they see a nutritionist, but if they're at high risk for developing type 2 diabetes based on this genetic test, then they could get those services now and help them stay in, you know, a healthy state rather than developing diabetes or liver failure. So I do think there's real opportunity there. There's not a lot of work being done. I mean, early on, there was a lot of work around behavior change for PRSs, and that was because there was a lot of concern about the opposite. Not that we would find a lot of people who are at increased risk, but that we were worried that if we found a bunch of people who were not at increased risk, they would say, oh, well, I can just go do whatever I want because I don't have a genetic risk and therefore I'm never going to get these diseases. And we found that wasn't true, right? And there were a number of studies published, you know, 15, 20 years ago about that. And it really didn't turn out that way, but there's more, a lot more work to be done in this area. Interestingly, I'm sure your viewers probably know about the emerge network. Do you?
Yeah, I do. Not everybody will, though. It might be worth talking about it.
Sure. So electronic medical records and genomic medicine, something like that. I always forget the name, but it's a network that's been funded by NHGRI now for many years. It started off by figuring out how do you start to incorporate genomic test results into a medical record. It was just groundbreaking work. It's changed the field tremendously, and it's had it's in this fourth round now. And what we're doing right now is they're recruiting 25,000 patients from across the US from a variety of ages, a variety of backgrounds, you know, low literacy populations, rural populations, as well as sort of the traditional academic medical center type of patients. And they're doing family history, a polygenic risk score, and monogenic testing on it's 10 different diseases.
Wow.
And putting together a report that says based on your family history, you're at higher or low risk for this specific condition, and based on your PRS, you're at higher or low risk based on this specific condition, and based on your monogenic test, you're at higher or low risk for this specific condition. Putting it all together and then giving that sort of overall assessment back to the patients and to the providers to see how does that change their healthcare, and what is it? What are the features that are motivating them most? Is it family history? Is it genetics? Is it PRS? You know. And so they're almost done recruiting. And so there'll be a lot of behavioral information that will come out of that study that will help us a lot with understanding the different motivations from the different pieces as well. It'll be really interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'll keep an eye on that. As we wrap up here, I wanted to just ask a little bit about MeTree. So this is a software platform that you've developed. So you obviously do a lot of you practice as a clinician, you do a lot of research, but you've taken, I think, a lot of these learnings and embedded it into a software platform that allows people to have pretty complex family history discussions and make sense of it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think it's an underappreciated technical challenge almost in delivering care, of how complicated family histories can be, and the missing information, and how you make sense of it to actually make it, you know, bring it from this unstructured thing that's in people's heads and in conversations around the dinner table and into actually a data structure that you can use and make sense of.
Yeah, it's been a long journey. It's been really fun and very rewarding. So yeah, family history, it was meant to be collected in primary care practices, right? It's one of those standard elements that's supposed to happen. But if you think about it, if you just go visit your doctor right now and sit down and they say, tell me about your grandparents' medical conditions, could you answer that question in any sort of meaningful way, right? You can't.
Very hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most people can't. And there's been a lot of lost information. I mean, my generation, like my grandparents, were separated from their family by World War II, and a lot of people died young in World War II, and we didn't practice the way we do now. Like back, even when I was like starting medical school, sometimes they would, you know, open up an older person and go, oh, there's cancer everywhere. We're just going to close them back up and let them go home, and they're going to, you know, they're going to pass away because this is not curable. they wouldn't try to find out what kind of cancer it was. They wouldn't, it was just, oh, that's bad, we're done. And sometimes people wouldn't even tell. Like some doctors, it's actually kind of shocking to me to think about this now, but there was a very paternalistic attitude.
Right.
And so sometimes they would not actually even tell the patient what their diagnosis was if they didn't think that it could be treated or managed. They would just say, nothing you can do, and send them home. So there is a lot of lost information. And so the thing that we started with first was, all right, what do we do today that will at least optimize as much as we can this kind of information? And so that is help them understand how to talk to their family members, who to talk to, what kind of information they need to ask, right? Allow them to log in and out of a platform that will actually guide them around what's the important pieces of information, and get it all down. And then we store it, and it's there as a living document that can be updated anytime, and generations can be added. So you can pass this document on down to your children, and they can add information from their kids and their, cousins and whatnot. And now people have this genealogy of medical problems, if you
Yeah,
will,
that's very interesting.
that, yes, that will serve as a permanent and living record for them. And so what we started to do was say, if we want this to serve that role, then we really need to make it publicly available, right? Instead of just a research tool, which is how we started with it. So we actually did license it from Duke so that we could offer it to people to use for that purpose. And then it provides back that information based on the information you've been able to enter so far. Here's what we know. Yeah. And then when they add new information, it will automatically update. And if there's missing information that's sort of critical, we can say, hey, if you know this information, it'd be really good to enter it, or go talk to someone to see if you can enter it, because it may change what we do with you.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
And can people share, like, if my brother and I, or my mother and I, can we collaborate on a tree? How does that work?
Yeah, so right now it's not set up to do that, but we are actually working on the newest version, which will allow that to actually have everybody kind of come in together. And initially the goal is you're going to enter information about all the people you know the most about, and then your brother will enter the info, right? And then we'll put it all in this one big pedigree you guys both can see, but from your specific account, you can do a risk assessment that's just around you, right?
Yeah, it's very cool.
But what we're looking forward to, actually, which is really, I think, the coolest thing, is that with FHIR, which is the fast healthcare interoperability resource that allows people to pull information out of their medical records about themselves, we can start to pull, because information in the medical record about family history is pretty awful, and a lot is times it's wrong. It's not only scanty, but it's wrong. We can now start to pull information about each relative out of their medical record, and that information is good. Right, the information about what your medical conditions are about you is really pretty good, and probably exceeds what you often would know. Like, it was stage 4, non-small cell lung cancer with these mutations, right?
And this is the dosage you were prescribed, and you don't remember that stuff. Yeah,
right, exactly. So we can start to pull that for each individual record, and so nobody has to enter family history anymore. I just need to know who your relatives are, and we can start pulling that information
and get them to consent to plug it in. And that's very cool. That's a really nice idea.
Yeah, very exciting. So we're going in that direction. We actually wrote a small business research grant around that topic, and we're hoping that we'll be able to move forward with that really soon, because that's a very exciting direction that the informatics has now enabled us to be able to do.
Absolutely. I'll put a link in the show notes, but if people want to check that out, it's MeTreeandyou.com, right? And that's me as in Emmy, MeTree and you. I really like the name. I think it's great. That's very cool. Otherwise, if people want to keep track of your work, if they want to get in touch with you, they can visit your profile on the Duke website. I think, are there specific things you're looking for? Collaborators? Are you hiring, or anything else?
Anything, anybody has any, I get emails all the time from people who, read about what I do and want to learn more, they've just started NCI and the Office of Public Health just started a new training and implementation science and dissemination for public genomic health.
Cool.
And so that just opportunity just opened up or just closed for the inaugural field, but I'm a faculty member in that. And I think that's going to be a really terrific resource for people who want to learn more about that field and get training in that field, specifically for genomics. Again, though, I'm happy to help guide people. I mentor a lot of people. I enjoy it. I think, this is how we make things happen.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I learned a ton today. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Cynogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit cynogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible, in particular Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.